Hello everybody, today I want to discuss the awkward celebration, quote unquote, of our reunification. The thumbnail is a quote from our president, which is a ceremonial role. He's not actually the head of our government, that is of course Angela Merkel, but he is formally the head of our state, as the Queen is the head of Great Britain. And he has given a speech to celebrate supposedly the 30 years of reunification. And it was difficult for me to select a quote that kind of matches his sentiments or the general sentiment of the speech, because as I've now picked it, it sounds like he's fairly honest and open and just wants to remove myth. But we are actually, of course, looking into a rewriting of our history right now. Mr. Steinmeier was not opposed to the reunification at the time. He was, in fact, writing for a magazine called Demokratie und Recht, which was financed by the GDR, the communist dictatorship in East Germany. The entire publishing house, Paul Rugenstein Verlag, had to go bankrupt after the reunification because the communists would not pay them anymore. At the part of his speech where he actually tries to rewrite the history, he goes into very lengthy sentences that are unquotable. So it's grammatically impossible to kind of catch a quote that would shine a light on what he actually thinks. And instead he is talking in very lengthy sentences about how we have to look critically at the process of the reunification, and we should look into the folders of the trust that ultimately sold off the state property. Of course, East Germany used to be a communist regime, so everything was owned by the government, and that trust, that had to sell off the property to private investors, that really must be scrutinized now, and he's very happy that now all the documents are open for the public, and that debate is being to be had now. So this was the twist his speech was taking, but of course he had used such a language that you cannot quote one sentence or another to make that clear. That's very sad, but it is not necessary for him to spell it out directly, because there's this underlying carpet of noise actually going on for 30 years that indicates what the public has to think about the reunification and about the trust that had sold off the state property. And based on that background noise that we are all acquainted with anyway, he doesn't have to be specific. He is riding on that wave, that carpet or whatever image you have prepared for him by the media. There was actually even a quote at the time of the reunification by our chancellor back then, Helmut Kohl, that in 40 years' time or at some point in the future, we might look back and see the reunification of an event pushed by communists in the East against the reluctant backwards wishes of the fascists in the West. And as far-fetched as it sounded back then, I think we are approaching this because our elites are paying lip service to the reunification with 100 of warnings, of course, but basically they pay lip service to the desirability of a unified country. And this is, of course, also why this event was called We Together. This is the church, Lutheran church style sleaze talk. It says nothing. It sounds cuddly, nice, sweet, kiss, kiss. And if you follow my channel, you know that it riles me up like nothing else, this constant sleaze. So they pay lip service to the unity just as a matter of camaraderie. We are together now. Labor workers of the world unite across all races and the 72 genders. You have to think of the vaginal fungi, or across all the religions. religions, and everybody we unite together and stand strong against the hostilities of fascism. And this is the way they gloss over their dismay over the reunification. So the fall of the wall has brought the country together. We are now brothers and loving, cutting, And if you have watched the speech Angela Merkel gave at Harvard University, she also talks about her upbringing in the East. She pays some lip service to the lack of freedom that she saw there, but she does not specify it outside of, there was actually a wall, so she could not walk down that street where there was a wall. So outside of that wall, if it were not for that very wall, she actually does not have anything to complain, and she was not a part of the resistance at all. She was actually rather supportive of the regime, and her parents moved from the West to the East to support the regime. So that's a different story. But anyway, our elites have decided that unification means sleaze, cuddly, brotherly, blah, 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 blah. And still they have to warn us for the nationalism that supposedly comes out of too much pride and love, cuddle, blah, 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 among one group of people. So I want to dive in a bit into this myth spinning that we have endured for the last 30 years. And a part of it is, of course, that your ability to see your cousins and remote family members in a different part of Germany again is so warm and cuddly and sweet that over it you become too proud of your country, and then suddenly you become hostile against outsiders. Of course, there are no logical connections between all of these things. From pride does not follow hostility and so forth. Nor does warmth and cuddle stuff result in pride. There are a million of logical gaps, but you realize how all of this is based on pure discussions of emotions. Its left has detached itself from any citizen who can argue, who has any logical thought in his mind. They only address emotions, and they only address people who are intellectually limited. And as a consequence, the sleaze about how nice it is that we are now together and brothers and so forth comes with a warning. Okay? And that warning is that we are still a diverse people. We must not become nationalist again, and that we are federal society. We have different regions with different specialties, which is true. The famous Lederhosen, for example, are only born in the south. Other regions have different cuisine, dialects, and so forth. The country had not been united until 1871 under one umbrella, so to say. It is a very diverse group of peoples that actually comprise the German people. So there's an overarching culture, but under it there are multiple subcultures, of course. And the other thing is that they always complain about the economic situation. As you might know, we have a shared currency now, actually with the rest of Europe, but before that the East mark was unified with the West mark, and the result was that of course the two economic systems had to be combined, and this is constantly presented as if everybody was just losing, particularly in the East, that Westerners should feel guilty. So the guilt game is on, just as it is in America with black people, or as in Australia with the Aborigines, you name it, every place has this guilt game now, and supposedly the people in the West should feel guilty for trying to invest in East German property and try to make something out of what was there. What is conveniently ignored in those discussions is that the East was bankrupt, so most of these productive sites did not actually produce anything anymore. They just existed to keep people busy so they don't pay attention to the dictatorship. So you have the choice of either shutting down the production sites or to continue work in these places, or activity in these places, because nobody wants to buy your stuff. You're actually just wasting your time. But you can continue those activities and run a minus. And the myth is that everybody was losing his job and was hopeless and so forth. And the reality is, of course, very mixed. As you can see from this chart, there was a small hike of unemployment at the early 90s, but then it stabilized fairly quickly in the East. Many people moved away, so that is a tragedy. But people found different activities, actual work, and it was actually surprisingly smooth if you think of thousands of companies being bankrupt. But despite this surprising smoothness, there is always on top this complaint about the economic disadvantage. And how this goes is that we barely talk about how great the cities look now. I mean, you could see with your bare eyes, you can look at photos, how the East looked in 1990 and how it looked 15 years later or 20 years later. Now we are obviously in a decline again for multiple reasons, the coronavirus being one, but there are more reasons why we are in a economic and also cultural decline, and we are losing our freedoms again. But for quite some time, people had the chance to build up a lot of stuff, and if you look at the pictures, you will be surprised how well things went. And on top of that, the left placed this rhetoric on the economics where they only focus on the difference. So what happened in reality was that, of course, the East improved immensely. I mean, it went up like this, and the West, of course, also improved a bit. But we don't talk much about this improvement. What we talk about all the time is the wages are still lower, the unemployment is still higher. So we are talking about that final gap. The left has the audacity to continuously pound down on that final small gap between the economies of the two parts of Germany. And so we are told for years and years and years that East Germans are deeply unhappy about their lives because they are still not equal. But they did not actually go into the streets to demand equality. They demanded improvements. They wanted to have a better life. They wanted to build up something, and they achieved it. They actually achieved a lot of that. And yes, maybe they will draw equal and even surpass the quality of life in the West. And I'm more than happy for everybody who makes it. But this was not the goal. The goal was actually to get rid of the tyranny so that people have a chance to get an improvement on their lives. Another trick they play is that a lot of the people who were dissidents in East Germany were actually more socialists than the socialists, meaning they believed the rhetoric, but they, of course, did not have to deal with the reality of the ramifications. So a lot of artists, they wanted a reunification under a different regime, so to say. They wanted a new constitution or whatever. They wanted to keep a democratic socialism. So the idea is that apparently socialism somehow works. It orders every aspect of your life and tells you what treaties you are, what business contracts you are supposed to make with whom, how much you are going to sell for what price, and what are you going to buy, and every minutiae of your life, in fact, is being guarded by these people, including your speech. And still, you could just remove some of the authoritarian instruments and that would work quite well. This is the idea a lot of these people believed in, because that was the entire propaganda they were soaking up from childhood. And they had very little to criticize the government for, but the lack of, or the difference between their rhetoric and the actuality. So if you claim to be a democracy, which all communist regimes do, they also protected free speech according to the East German constitution, and then you don't deliver. That was then the point they pounded on. But of course, for pure logical reasons, and now that we have this wider discussion where people could actually talk to people in the West and so forth. Now, later, most people have realized that markets are actually essential to freedom, and that you cannot control everybody's life to the minutiae and also still have freedom. Well, obviously, does not come together. And still we are, of course, having all these witnesses from the past that were dissidents. Somehow for they criticize the government for not being communist enough, not living up to their promises. So this is played, and also, of course, people are dismayed for the mentioned economic reasons, but also for the supposed lack of representation. Again, here you hear Black Lives Matter speak. This is now actually taken, I would say, from Black Lives Matter and other social justice warrior groups, and is transposed to the German context, when now we are moaning about the lack of authorities that have a biography in East Germany. Now, for the matter of the dissidents being pushed down aggressively by the public at the time, there are a few people who could actually move up the social and political ladder without having that communist ideology. So what they actually try to do with that entire representation game is they want more communists in positions of power. But of course, there are not just some few voices here and there, and I would not make this entire video if it were so. Welt, for example, that used to be a conservative newspaper, and it has now uploaded a video satisfied with unity, for example. They ask, should we have the reunification? Are you satisfied? So, you have this smearing of the reunification. Then there is an article in Deutschlandfunk that asks for or that praises authors and movie makers who seek to tell the story of the GDR outside of cliches of perpetrators and their victims and the unpolitical Mitläufer. That's how we call people who did not object in any way or form to the tyranny around them. Also, when we speak about the Third Reich. This story, the story of the perpetrators and victims, which is barely told anyway, is supposed to be downgraded ever more. And Wolfgang Schiller, the author, praises authors who go a different way and just speak about the sorrows of the aftermath of the reunification and not the sorrows of what happened before. Zeit, my favorite newspaper, always goes to the extreme, and they have now even published an article that asks or that tells their readers how cool the GDR were. They literally put in the title where the GDR was the coolest. So this is about holiday spots and stuff. Where was it the coolest? Okay, where was the dictatorship the coolest? Yeah! And then they have a second article written by Maximilian Probst that asks or that titles with rather talk about the future. Of course, we are progressive, and the progress is always toward communism anyway, and if you want something else, you're in the way, or you're backwards. So just rather think of the future than of the communist dictatorship of the past. And he says the word of the I don't know why he says the word of the unity. He means the unity is a sad story. The unity is a sad story. It covered up the differences, as if all these people who marched on the street were obsessed about the differences, and it gave false hopes. Oh my goodness! And he suggests that we should not celebrate the anniversary. And of course, there was this speech that I mentioned at the very beginning. I want to thank YouTube for the double speed function. I listened to it. So my quick rundown. He talks about the emperor. He talks about 1871 and how he has seen pictures of children in military uniforms, and for whatever reason, the reunification has to do with nationalism and military, and it's all just one thing, and therefore you should be cautious. Then he says, in contrast to that backdrop of military stuff, in 1871, the reunification happened peacefully, but in that part of the speech he barely actually mentions the activists who made this happen. He speaks of the international community, the politicians Gorbachev, Bush, and so forth, who supposedly brought it about. then he thanks the globalism as such and internationalism, and goes back to the emperor and how under the Reich there was already this anti-Semitism and sexism and so forth. But we are not talking about the Reich, right? Are we? And he managed to go to the length of discussing the flag of the Reich, and I'm not sure if I even want to explain that hint, that reference, but it just shows that he really wants to talk about anything else but the reunification. And in the midst of it, he says, unity of freedom and diversity, a unity which must be defined Europeanly. It doesn't. What is Europeanly? But it's a verbatim translation, so we have to celebrate the diversity and unity, while unity as Europeanly. Okay. So he is unable to actually speak about the events and why he was not on board with it and so forth. As next, he said the change that hit East Germans was harder there than in the West. It leaves vestiges in the curricula vitae of the people and in our hearts. So it's all dire and black and bad. He tells us that the changes hit East Germans harder than us in the West. It leaves vestiges in the curricula vitae and in our hearts. So it's all very dark and blackish and so forth. And he swears that the differences, we must not rest. I'm not quoting verbatimly. We must not rest until disadvantages are removed. I have seen an older video where he even says about the reunification process that this all happened without hate for the government, which is quite peculiar. So it was a peaceful revolution, and supposedly not just only peaceful, but also these people were not even against the government, or they were not even angry with the government, but they were in perfect harmony without government, and still they removed it. At the same time, of course, they were obsessed about the differences to West Germany, and not about the cruelty of that government, which they are not supposed to have hated. He finally proposes a monument to honor or to remember the reunification. And again, I think this is the standard response to anything. The left just throws some taxpayer money into a corner, so they have some formalized lip service ceremony in that place, but they don't really care to think about anything specific. They don't really care about other people. Maybe there will be a monument, maybe not. I don't know. But this is actually rather a sign of the lack of interest that the West has for the East, and I would even say there is a lack of interest the West has for democracy as such. I have become really cynical. That's why I'm making this channel. So I hope you understand now better what is going on. We are now a reunified country, and people from the East, like Angela Merkel, have moved to the top and have joined forces with people from the West left to tell us what communism is and is not, what dictatorship is and what is not, and what democracy is and what is not. And it is surprisingly different from what you thought it is. That was it for today, and I hope I will come back sooner again.